What better way to sell a war agenda than to use a celebritard? Now, okay, that may be a little bit hyperbolic. Let me rephrase that. What better way to sell the war agenda than using a person of influence, a celebrity who genuinely thinks that he's doing the right thing? This is the case that we want to talk about with specifically Ben Stiller, actor and comedian, quote, getting personal with Congress on Syrian humanitarian crisis. There's a whole bunch of articles all over the mainstream media toting this. There's been a lot of coverage. ABC News actor Ben Stiller speaks out on Syria as U.S. warns of intensifying violence. CNN, this is the most incredulous comment of them all here. Definitely CNN. Ben Stiller lends voice to Syrian refugees as white helmets warn of Russian escalation. Now, of course, there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to be playing a little bit of what Ben Stiller said, a reaction from Rand Paul, which does need to be commended, but there's a lot of disinformation to break down here. Where do we start, Jason?
Well, there is a lot because this was a 90-minute hearing. He has another UN official next to him, and I think that he's completely sincere. I'm a Ben Stiller guy. I like Ben. I think he's a funny dude. I love Something About Mary, one of my favorite comedies of all time. And I cut this clip up so you can kind of see his introduction. Now, this is going to tug on some heartstrings. And the other thing is, it's true. It's not propaganda. It's real. These people are refugees and they are desperate. The problem is that Stiller and his cohorts are not going to tell you how this started. Not only with us arming the Civil War, but Operation Timber Sycamore and bringing in military forces into that region, Luke.
Not only that, but the celebritard, again, me and Jason disagree here. So he's pushing for H.R. 1677. He's pushing for more sanctions. I mean, and then Rand Paul kind of questions on him. He kind of backs off. But let's just play a little bit of this kind of emotional heartstringing that he uses in the beginning, which, again, you're probably right. Is pretty legitimate. He doesn't look like a liar here, but let's play it.
Well, again, I want to preface this. He's not a liar. He's gone overseas. He's met these people. Refugees exist, and I think a lot of
I've been to many of the refugee camps, and he doesn't look like a liar. I said that. He doesn't look like a liar. I mean, people lie about this stuff all the time. I mean, why isn't he in Yemen, China, or Saudi Arabia? But that's a whole other topic. Let's get to him.
In many parts of the world, the term refugee has unfortunately become politicized, despite the fact that refugees are real people with real stories. Stories that are some of the most frightening and traumatic I've heard, especially as a father. I've tried to imagine how I would feel if caught in the middle of conflict and unable to protect my children, if my son was at risk of forced recruitment or my daughter at risk of unimaginable violence.
Let me stop that for a second. People don't, well, you roll your eyes, but think about that. If we just, and we're going to show video of this, when you see what the Syrian military is like, forget about the rebels or whatever. Forced recruitment's a real issue, Luke. You don't think?
Yeah. Recruitment by who? Al-Qaeda in that region, specifically Syria, where all the money and arms were thrown. Again, that's the bigger issue here that's not addressed. Again, why did he go to Syria? There's a lot more refugees. There's a bigger humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Why isn't Ben Stiller in Yemen? Why isn't there a major celebritard talking on the House about Yemen and getting all the media coverage that he's getting? That's my argument here, and that's why I believe it's a little bit more disingenuous than you do, Jason.
Well, I don't think he's being disingenuous. That's my point.
No, I don't think so either.
I understand what this is. I'm saying he's using a real issue, and then they're usurping it to get things like sanctions. But again, these things are real. I think this is important because, again, when you have kids, can you imagine them being in that situation? Let's continue.
Honestly, for me, it's not something I want to think about. If any of us were to take a moment to really consider this, we would have a tiny sense of what everyday life is like for millions of people around the world. Getting a chance to meet some of these people and hear their stories firsthand has been a privilege. Immediately, it becomes clear what we all have in common. Though we come from different cultures and totally different worlds, we all want the same things: to provide a good environment for our kids to grow up in, to laugh and share experiences with family and friends, to see our children grow up and achieve their dreams. These are things we all want no matter who or where we are. And every time I leave and say goodbye, I'm aware that but for being born in a different country, it could well be me and not them sitting in a small, cold, makeshift shelter and not being able to do any of these things.
So let me stop it there, because I think that in a lot of ways, Luke, this is important, and I know you're rolling your eyes, but the alternative media has completely flipped on this idea. Instead, there's a lot of Islamophobia out there. Yes, I'm going to say it. That doesn't mean I endorse Islam. But just like this man said, other cultures, whether you believe in them morally, I don't think that women should be wearing hijabs. Not my place to say. I get it. There is oppression out there. But essentially, Luke, they want the best for their children. They want a life. They want peace.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it Islamophobia, Jason. I would disagree with that. I would call it more statist bootlicking of the establishment talking points that alternative media thinks they need to repeat and regurgitate in order to be popular. And that's why we don't see any legitimate criticism of Saudi Arabia from them anymore like we used to. And if someone was Islamophobic, all you have to look at Saudi Arabia as an example to give someone a sort of an argument. It's not a valid argument, but sort of an argument with that case. So that's another argument I want to make here. He's specifically pushing HR 1677. It's the Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Act. And again, the bill, which is now in the Senate level, after it did pass the House, it urges the U.S. government to impose diplomatic and economic sanctions against Syria's dictator regime. This is the Washington Post of Bashar al-Assad. Again, pushing a major political agenda. Rand Paul, one of the few people, I had my disagreements with him, but from everything I'm hearing now, he came out firing. He came off and made some really good points. Could we play some of his video?
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah, because again, Rand Paul is one of the few people who actually on the world stage is actually able to talk about a lot of these issues. You look at the people going against a lot of the bigger bullcrap. There's not many of them anymore. Who's out there? Thomas Macy? No, what's his name? Forgot his name. There's only a few representatives out there that actually do lead a voice that's truly anti-war, and Rand Paul is one of them.
This terrible humanitarian disaster. I think when we look at it, it's easy just to talk about what we should do to help the refugees, but we also should think about what caused this to begin with. Worldwide, it's either a natural disaster, lack of food, lack of water, or war. More often than not, it's both war and, naturally difficult land to harvest crops from. But if we don't understand that war causes refugee crisis and war causes humanitarian crisis, we're not getting anywhere. And there really does need to be a discussion of how do we get here. To me, there's a certain degree of irony that we and our allies and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE sent thousands of tons of weapons into Syria. And then after the aftermath of all of these weapons coming together in this clash of civil war, now that we're going to be asked to pay for the humanitarian disaster as well. Maybe we should try to have, less involvement in these civil wars, less escalation of these civil wars. ISIS, we had to go back in and fight ISIS. Where did ISIS come from? The chaos of this civil war. Terrorism breeds in chaos. And so maybe we really need to rethink when we get involved in these civil wars and whether our involvement is good or bad. People say, well, if we wouldn't have gotten involved, Assad would have won the war. Yeah, he probably would have won the war in the first 6 months. Would there have been oppression? Yes, there would have been oppression. But do you think that's worse somehow than the millions of people that are displaced and the hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed in this? And these are things we should think through. My question to Mr. Stiller is, you said that you require, in order to meet the humanitarian needs, you require unhindered access. Do you think more sanctions on Syria will lead to less hindered access, or do you think more sanctions might actually lead to more hindered access to develop humanitarian aid?
I won't venture to speculate on sanctions in my role as a witness to the humanitarian plight that I've seen for UNHCR. Right. I think it's obviously an incredibly complicated political situation.
Let me stop it there. You notice he doesn't want to talk anything about the sanctions. This is the
Wait,
only
just really quick. It was Thomas Macy and Justin Amash that I was thinking about, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only person that even posed this question to Stiller because, again, he's there kind of as the emotional point, the face of this, to promote it. And, the stories he tells, they are rough and they are real. However, at the end of the day, what Stiller's about to promote after this is more of this type of behavior, of going into other places. He talks about Central America. I believe he talks about parts of Africa. And look, the bottom line is, if we didn't have these types of policies, we wouldn't need the United Nations in there. And when the white helmets, which are UN have been exposed as working with Al-Qaeda, that's a problem. That's a real problem. That's a real thing. And none of that is ever talked about here. So let's let Stiller finish it up.
And what I would speak to with UNHCR and to what International Rescue Committee is doing is it's about figuring out the best way to have access within Syria to allow a path for these people to go home, to have a safe place for them to go back home. So it's a very complicated issue.
Right.
I don't do it for a living, but I would say that it's when you see the face of it in person, and I agree with you, these root causes have to be addressed. I think that's the key. But when you see the face of it in person and what's going on there now, I think it's just very important that we do everything we can to help.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that some see sanctions as war by another name. It's a softer form of war, but it's a war goes on. It's not acknowledging that basically the war is over and that somehow the tide is going to change and Assad will be defeated by sanctions. Now, I don't think he will be defeated by sanctions. I think the humanitarian crisis continues and actually probably grows from not sending aid in and putting sanctions on people who would send aid in. So I think we really do need to rethink this. Sanctions is not going to change the outcome of the war in there, but I think it will change the ability for the country to recover. You know, I'm no fan of Assad. I'm not glad that he won the war, but the war is largely over. There still is pockets of resistance in different places, but the war is largely over. And if we want to correct the humanitarian crisis, forbidding trade with Syria is probably not a good way. Embargoes lead to starvation. You know, there was an embargo on Japan before the war, embargoes on Germany. They didn't prevent the war. They actually may have brought the war on as well. So I think we ought to rethink what we're doing as far as how we treat this. There's one thing to give money and to feed people, and that's admirable. But it's another to continue the war and think that somehow we're going to change the outcome. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Rand Paul, for some common sense and some logic here. Sanctions, pretty much just another form of economic war. And we have to understand, he made a good point. The United States keeps starting all these conflicts. Why don't we just stop doing that? If you want to prevent more, humanitarian crises like the ones that are happening in Yemen, like the very kind of similar one in Latin America, stop overthrowing government. Stop supporting rebel groups that are terrorists. I mean, it's that simple. And sanctioning them, like, how is that? He made a great point. How is that limiting what can go in and out of the country? How is that going to help the refugees in that country? How? I have no absolute idea to any kind of sense or logic here from any of these individuals. And yes, they may be bleeding heart celebritards and they may care. Yes, they might have been there. Yes. But it doesn't stop all the important facts surrounding this case because the facts matter here. And the reality of the situation is a lot more complicated than just the emotional ones that are being thrown out there for you to consume by the mainstream media, establishment, elite, PR talking points. Bam. That's all I have to say. Anything else you want to say, Jason?
No, it's time to go. It's time to get out of there. We both know it. When you watch these troops mobilizing, this means more war, folks.
Lower the volume, yeah.
Yeah, that's
well, those are Syrian troops moving to Idlib, which Al-Qaeda has had a strong presence in. This is not a major army. This is not a major force. When we're sanctioning them, we're sanctioning the forces that are fighting the radical elements that the United States financed in that country. Many people forget that.
Yeah. So again, Stiller puts a rough face on it. We all want people to be able to live in their homes and have food, but the answer is not more sanctions, which means more military intervention. Believe the hype. That's what's the reality, and I'm glad Rand Paul said that. We're doing 4 videos across 2 platforms, Pulse Change, We Are Change. Make sure you're subscribed to both. Ring those bells for notifications. Share this stuff on social media and get out there and be the change you want to see in the world.